And Mary, I'm still looking. I still don't see the slides. Oh, thank you. Great. Perfect timing. Welcome to Sprint 131 Review. The sprint ended on March 2nd. Next slide, please. Okay, so I will do the intro and some of the statistics. Carol will do community. Harpreet will do the UI update. Adam will speak about the providers. Tina will cover automate. Joe V will handle the platform, and that will be the end. Next slide, please. Right, so we had a nice increase in the number of PRs merged this sprint. It was up from 177 to 254. That was a nice jump. Also, the number of PRs opened also jumped from 199 to 267. That was a nice spike there in the number of PRs being opened. The backlog of open PRs continues to decline. I think that's in part due to an increased backlog grooming and issue triaging that's been going on for the past month or so. So I expect that will continue. Next slide, please. And the majority of PRs were enhancements. It's not quite 2-to-1 compared to bug fixes, but pretty close. And also bug fixes also increased, so that's overall everything was up, which is good. Next slide, please. And the big winner here was the VMware provider. Had the biggest change, and all of the change there was in the positive. So that was a nice delta this month. Next slide, please. And on to Carol.
All right, thanks, Dennis. So for for community, we have a very cool 4-part blog post series on embedded Ansible, written by Peter McGowan. So you can see there's built-in Ansible roles, passing parameters to the playbook, Ansible in automation workflow, as well as working with state machines. And thanks to Drew as well for editing and formatting the parts of the blog posts for the ManageIQ blog, and so providing the content readily available to everyone. So that's it for this week. Thanks, and next slide, please.
Hello, everyone. So total of 48 PRs merged across UI and API repos. That includes 15 enhancements, 13 bug fixes, and so on. For enhancements, there were multiple PRs to address changes in React password component, such as changes were made to pass down edit prop to async credential component for its parent from its parent component, as it was not available to its child components. And in a follow-up PR, an obsolete edit attribute was removed from default props. Secret switch field was renamed to password field in component mappings, and helper text for password component and its all child components was implemented. On the overt provisioning dialog, a new field was added to allow user to set specific disk sparsity along with disk format for the disks with validation. And in the API repo, CRUD was implemented for policy profiles. Compliances subcollection was added for VMs. Subcollections, authentications, and endpoint were added for providers to be able to populate the data-driven forms with that information. API support was added for OpenID Connect and OAuth 2. And the support was added to log a message in API log file for any deprecated collections and subcollections. Also, existing provider editing endpoint was extended to support data-driven forms. Next slide, please. For the bug fixes, list of a physical infrastructure server was throwing an error when pressing any buttons such as turn on or off LED in the toolbar buttons when a button was pressed without selecting an item in the list. So fix was made to only enable buttons when at least one of the items was selected from the list. That's being consistent with other parts of the UI. A fix was made to show add a provider screen when there are no configuration providers in the database. In some of the cases, the screen was not being rendered correctly. Fix was made to SVG upload in generic object area code was expecting image to be SVG type, but from Chrome browser, it was being uploaded as SVG plus XML. So a fix was made in a couple of different places to handle that type. Notification drawer initialization code was fixed to prevent login screen pop-up. This PR also contains some other fixes that were introduced in React rewrite of notification drawer in previous sprint. Load inputs for Ansible methods was fixed in the method editor. The input and host fields were not visible for, I think, job template and workflow template type of methods for on the form as well as on the summary screen. So a fix was made for that. A fix was made on infrastructure dashboard screen to limit metrics rollups to default time profile to fix an issue with duplication of values on global utilization chart. And the next 4 PRs are related to issues with save of attribute value pairs for custom buttons. The two fixes were made in the classic UI, and 2 PRs were merged in API repo. And the ability to delete a region from API was removed because that could break the appliance, especially if there was only one region that was deleted. And finally, a bug was fixed when queuing a VM to retire through API. That's all I have for UI. Over to Adam.
I don't think we have Adam.
I think he's on in another call, but I'm not sure.
Well, I can do a quick take here. So in the core, as you can see, there was adding associations for networks and NICs. The VMware template model was added. Overt had three features added here. The collecting disk format and provision type during the refresh was a good enhancement. Allowing the user to set format for the thin and thick provision during provisioning. That was been requested for a while, so that was something we're waiting for a little while. And there was a fix to a bug causing refresh errors with local FS type storage domains. That was also something that's been requested by a few customers. Next slide, please.
Hey, Dennis, are we back? Can you hear us?
You're back. You're back.
All right. Sorry. Drew forgot to press star 4 to unmute, so. All right. On the VMware side, we actually a community user added the support for SATA disk controller types. Before, we only had support for SATA and SCSI. So if you had a SATA type disk, it would actually fail because we were trying to add the same unique key for an IDE and a SATA disk, which was failing. We published the vCenter simulator config files. So if you want to record your own VCRs, it's easier to do that. You just pull those down and drop them onto any vCenter 5.5, and it'll become a VCR recording simulator. We set the thin and format attributes of the disks. That was something that the Rev team added to the core schema, and so we're setting them in VMware as well. We fixed a targeted refresh bug when you were targeting a distributed switch. There was a problem where connections to the host were being deleted. So now that's fixed up. Big push here to improve spec coverage, so it's up from about 55% to about 67%, and that's going to continue for the next couple of sprints. Hope to get it up into at least the 80 to 90% range. We removed some unused code. Now the graph refresh is the only option. There was some refresh parser code that isn't needed anymore. We moved the traversal spec, which is how we traverse through the nested tree on the VMware side. It's basically just a static definition. We pulled it out of code and moved it to a YAML file, so it'll be easier to update on the fly. We also removed all usage of the MIQ fault-tolerant Vim class, which is intended to work around issues using DRB to access the Vim broker. Since that's no longer used anymore, we don't need fault-tolerant Vim. So that's not used in code anymore, and then next sprint we'll hopefully delete it from the VMware Web Service gem. And that's it for providers. Next slide.
Thanks, Adam. Good morning. We had 8 PRs merged this sprint. As Harpreet mentioned, Drew resolved the VM retirement API issue that was introduced when we changed VM retirement processing to run a policy prevent check prior to creating the retirement request. Service retirement doesn't have an issue because there's no policy prevent check. Patrick added logging for non-existing active record objects on the service model import. Jay addressed more Rubocop issues. Thank you for your contribution, Jay. And finally, consolidated email was introduced in the Hammer release. In this sprint, Billy removed the deprecated email classes. That's it for Automate. Next slide, over to Joe.
Thank you, Tina. So this sprint, 37 PRs were merged across the multiple platform repos, most notably starting with enhancements. Adam contributed one to make systemd the default for worker management. It's been an option for months. Now it'll just become the default. Joar contributed an enhancement to avoid eager loading of ManageIQ API client and Cube client. Instead, they'll only be loaded as needed. Nixie contributed a few enhancements. He made a change to productize pods without a product name. He did this by allowing for changing the app name in the pod's object based on an environment variable. He also added support for deploying worker containers from registries requiring credentials by adding a provider image pull secret to deployed worker containers. He replaced more yum commands with DNF in the Docker file, as the base images were moved to UBI 8, where DNF is the preferred tool. And he made an enhancement to use multi-stage builds to remove the need for secret container. He did this by including the secret in a build argument and only copying over files as they're needed, leaving no trace on the file system. And so he made a few enhancements to our build. Most notably, he increased the size for the vert V2V of the disk space, added build of the V2V conversion host appliance, which is a different form from the rest of the appliances we currently build. And she made various changes to update our appliances to CentOS space. Next slide, please. And on to bugs. There we go. Joar fixed reporting formatter traceback seen when running rake EVM start, and he did this by moving report formatter and charting into the core. Nixie addressed a CVE by bumping the version of rake, and he resolved a locale issue by adding glibc language pack. Dan updated Nokoguri version to pull in multiple security fixes. Martin H. fixed a bug that had required the user to enter their credentials twice when logging into the self-service UI. And Sadoi fixed a date parsing issue for V2V appliances that had inadvertently been introduced in a prior PR. For technical debt and refactoring, Nixie made a couple of changes to get the pod namespace from a built-in file instead of an environment variable, since the file is always present. This also allowed the mypod namespace environment variable to be removed. Brandon removed a no longer needed MIQ region migrations ran column, and Adam extracted the core managed, unmanaged resources methods out of various log methods. Last slide, please. Next slide, please. And for continuous integration and testing, Dan contributed a couple of improvements to ensure more robust spec runs. And lastly, Nick L. and Brandon contributed multiple improvements to the MIQ bot, which I won't go over each of them, but they're listed on the slide. And that's it for the platform space. Next slide, please.
Okay, that concludes the Sprint 131 review. We'll get together again on March 18th for the Sprint 132 review. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.